The wind came in hard off the ridgeline, dragging snow like smoke through the pines. A lesser man would have turned back, but the rancher rode on, his coat stiff with ice, his breath loud in the hush of the storm. Hoofprints melted behind him. The Mari grunted, slipping on hidden stone, but he kept to the frozen creek bed where the wind cut least. That was when he saw her. A lump, half covered in white, not moving. The snow had tried to claim her as its own, folding around her in soft drifts, but she hadn't been there long enough for the cold to finish the job. One arm stuck out, pale, bare, fingers curled like claws. He dismounted slow, knee creaking. Knelt beside her, got no breath at first, then a shallow hitch barely there. She was young. Not too young, worn at the edges. A woman who'd known work. And worse. Beneath a man's threadbare coat, a torn wedding dress clung to her bones. Her feet were bare and cut. One braid, loose and matted, stuck to her cheek. Her lips were cracked. She didn't open her eyes. He lifted her without a word, holding her close to his chest where the last of his warmth still lived. The Mare whinnied, uneasy. He mounted in silence and turned toward home, snow thickening behind them like a curtain. Drawn, the cabin waited at the tree line, squat, shingled with bark, its chimney breathing thin smoke into the gray. He kicked the door open with a boot and laid her down before the hearth where the coals still glowed. No fire burned yet. He'd left too early that morning, hunting strays. Now he struck flint and coaxed the light back. Sparks danced. Shadows. Stretched Dot, she stirred only once. When he peeled the coat from her shoulders and saw the marks, red, raw lashes crossing her back like vines grown wrong. He said nothing, just turned away and fetched the wool blanket from his own cot, covering her gently. Her hands were purple and swollen. He warmed them between his own, slow as spring melt. When she finally blinked her eyes open, she said nothing. Just stared, not at him but past him, as if she'd expected someone else. Someone cruel. He ladled water into a tin cup, left it beside her. She didn't touch it, didn't cry. Just shivered, eyes wide, throat silent. He didn't ask her name, didn't offer his. There was a rhythm to the rancher's days. Quiet, spare, stitched from wood smoke and ash. He kept to it, tending the fire, sharpening tools, feeding the stock when weather allowed. She watched him from the cot, half-curled like a wounded dog. When he looked her way, her fingers tightened around the blanket, knuckles white. She had the look of someone who didn't believe she'd live through the week, and didn't much. The second day she rose to sit, that was progress. He left bread on the table, hard but fresh. She ate when he was outside, never while he watched. Her eyes stayed on the rifle propped by the door. She never touched it, but she measured. The distance, always Dot outside, the wind howled through the pines and the roof groaned beneath the weight of snow. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, throwing amber light on old walls and older scars. He didn't mean to frighten her. Didn't mean to keep her either. But each day she stayed, and each day the snow didn't stop Dot by the fifth morning. She'd taken to folding the blanket, to washing the tin cup. Tiny things, rituals, proof of a mind coming back from whatever edge it had teetered near. He watched, careful not to intrude. He caught her eye once, just once, while she wrung out a rag by the window. Her stare was sharp now, measured. Not grateful, but not afraid either. The storm outside eased. The silence inside remained Dot in a world that had used her and tossed her into the cold. Survival wasn't mercy, Dot, it was a test. And she hadn't passed it yet, but she was still breathing. And that was something. The thaw came slow, veiled in gray skies and dripping icicles. Beneath the eaves, the snow receded like an old regret. Inside, the cabin breathed a little easier. So did she. She moved now, careful, tentative steps across plank floors that groaned under the weight of silence. Her presence was ghost-like, yet steady. She no longer flinched at the sound of boots or the creak of the door. Instead, she began to occupy the space with quiet certainty, sweeping ash from the hearth, folding the blanket into tight corners, slicing roots and potatoes for stew without being asked. The cabin, once built for one, now echoed with the faint rustle of two. The coat still hung from her shoulders, frayed at the seams, patched once at the elbow. Too big. Always had been. When she reached for the pot or leaned over the fire, the sleeves swallowed her hands. She never took it. Off, safe to sleep. And even then it stayed within reach. Sometimes she'd sit near the window and undo her braid, letting strands fall loose like memories. Then slowly, methodically, she'd rebraid it, tighter each day, a kind of armor. One she could build with her own hands. At night she pulled a worn shawl from beneath her cot and pressed it to her face, breathing into its fabric like it might remember her before she forgot herself. It was the only thing that hadn't been dirtied by blood or frost or touch. Pale green with tiny white threads, faded but still whole. She kept it folded, always. A relic, a promise. The rancher didn't ask her story. Not when she began washing the tin plates. Not when she strung the broken curtain back on its rod. Not even when she sat on the porch steps after sundown, watching the pines disappear into mist. He watched, though. Quietly, saw the way she tensed at distant thunder. Noticed how she stared at the rifle by the fire, then reached for it one day with purpose, wiping the barrel down like she knew it better than most. She did. The wolves called one evening, low, lonesome cries from the ridgeline. She didn't. Startle, just stirred the stew slower, as if the howling matched a rhythm she remembered. The rancher took his coffee by the stove and said nothing. Later that night, when the oil lamp burned low and the walls breathed smoke and sap, he noticed. The marks on her wrist? Not fresh old ones. Clean lines, cross-hatched, almost surgical in precision. Scars left not by rope or whip, but her own hand, long before the frost. He didn't speak. Didn't shift or cough or make his noticing known. He only reached down, added another log to the fire, and poured a second cup of coffee. She watched the steam rise, and for the first time, took the cup before he walked away. The gesture wasn't comfort. It wasn't kindness, it was something else. Recognition, maybe? A silent truth between two people who didn't believe in. Rescue. She sat at the table that night, cradling the mug in both hands, eyes fixed on the wall. The flicker of flame played across her cheek, highlighting bruises that had faded to yellow. The coat still draped around her like a memory not yet buried, and maybe that's what it was. A memory, not warmth, not protection. Just something left. Behind by a man who once claimed to care, but left her with wolves instead of vows. She hadn't run from danger, not exactly. She'd run from the feeling that she deserved it. That her pain had been a fair price for being too much or not enough. That being loved was something she'd used up long ago. Now she sat in a cabin built by calloused hands, wrapped in a stranger's silence and firelight. No questions asked. No answers needed. And for the first time in years, she began to wonder what it might feel like to be seen, not as someone's burden, but as someone still here. The storm came down from the north, thick and hard and fast, like a punishment or a reckoning. Wind howled through the pines in long, bitter wails, and snow rose sideways in sheets that erased the world beyond the gate. The Murray wouldn't go out in it. Even the cabin moaned beneath the weight. They'd settled into something like rhythm, the woman, the rancher, the fire. No names, no promises, just silence that no longer chafed. That morning she'd stirred the beans while he hauled wood. And for a moment it had felt like something older than both of them. Something that belonged, but the storm had other plans. Late afternoon brought the sound, hooves pounding against the snowpack. Uneven, wrong. The rancher opened the door and the wind slammed it back against the wall. Through the white, a shape approached, slumped forward in the saddle, head low, arms wrapped around the horse's neck. He didn't hesitate. Just stepped into the storm, boots crunching, and grabbed the reins. The rider fell into his arms, young, bloodied, eyes rolling white. The snow had already frozen into his braids. He was Pawnee, barely 20. Shot through the side, the woman stood frozen in the cabins. Sent her as the rancher carried him in, laid him on the cot, and barked a word she didn't know. A command, a plea. She moved, hot water, clean cloth. Needle, thread, her hands no longer trembled. She pressed gauze to the wound, cleaned it, held it as the rancher peeled back layers of buckskin. The bullet was shallow, but angry. She threaded the needle with calm, tight fingers and began to stitch. The young man, barely conscious, groaned in his native tongue. "Waddy," the rancher muttered. "His name's Waddy." The woman said nothing. When it was over, they sat by the fire, the three of them. The wind screamed outside. Waddy breathed in shallow bursts. The woman poured water, spooned broth. The rancher stood at the door, rifle in hand, watching shadows move beyond the trees. Later he explained, few words. Just enough. Waddy was part of the band that had helped him once long ago. There were men now who wore tin stars and hunted natives. Like wolves, called it bounty work. Law didn't much care. Waddy had ridden south, too close to a town that didn't forget skin. She listened without asking more. She understood enough that night the cabin changed. The woman watched the way the rancher looked at Waddy, with care, not pity, with the quiet respect of men who have both bled and saved. She watched the way he moved when he spoke Pawnee. Slower, softer, like the words themselves knew the land better than English ever had. Something in her stirred. Something old. Not trust, not yet, but the memory of it. I woke near midnight, fevered but alive. She sat with him while the rancher slept in his chair, arms crossed, hat tipped forward. Waddy murmured names in his sleep. "Once," he said. "A brother." She smoothed his brow with a rag and whispered nothing. By dawn, the snow had lightened. The cabin smelled of fire and pine and sweat. Waddy breath steady now. The rancher lit the stove again. She made coffee. No one spoke. Later, she stepped outside alone. The world was white and wide and silent, untouched snow spreading to the horizon like blank paper. She pulled the too big coat tight around her. Her braid hung loose, damp from steam. The shawl clung to her shoulders like a memory. She looked out at the trees, at the wind still rustling the upper branches. And for the first time since the river, she didn't feel hunted. Behind her, the rancher stepped onto the porch. She didn't turn, just stared into the cold. "Thank you," she said. He didn't reply. Just stood with her, shoulder to shoulder, breathing in the same sharp air. Not all silence was cruelty. Some men spoke with action, and some women, after enough winters, learned how to listen. The thaw didn't arrive all at once. It crept in like guilt, soft and slow, turning the snow to slush and the silence to something heavier. Rain replaced the wind, tapping on the roof in the evenings like someone too polite to knock. The world outside the cabin came back to life in shades of brown and gray, and with it came the small sounds of work, rope creaking, wood split, a bucket being set down too gently. Inside, the cabin shifted. Waddy stood straighter now. His steps no longer shuffled. He mended a busted gate with the rancher and fed the stock without needing to be told. But it wasn't Waddy who made the changes echo. She lingered in the light now. She sat at the table longer, unafraid of being seen. Her hands, once slow, now moved with purpose. She found an old curtain stuffed behind a rafter, mildewed and stiff, and washed it until the water turned black. She rehemmed it, hung it back across the crooked window with a look that said she dared it to fall again. Then she found the dress, folded deep in a cedar chest beneath cracked blankets, a wedding gown, yellowed with age, the lace at the collar eaten through. She didn't weep, just stared at it a long while before taking it down to the creek, scrubbing it clean until her knuckles bled. That night she burned it in the stove. The rancho stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, watching the smoke curl. He didn't ask, just went back to his chair and polished the handle of his knife like nothing had changed. But something had. The next morning, when she handed him a tin plate of beans, her fingers brushed his. A pause too long, a breath caught. He froze, didn't meet her eyes. She pulled back, ashamed. That night, the rasp of whetstone on axe blade lasted longer than it should have. A rhythm too deliberate, as though he was carving silence into something sharper. Waddy said nothing, just sat at the fire, threading rawhide through a cracked boot sole, watching them both with the patience of someone who understood storms long before they formed. Outside, the river swelled with meltwater, dark and fast. Birds returned, cautious and quick. Inside, the space between them stretched, taut, thin, but unbroken. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the far ridge. Just a shadow at first, but she saw him before the rancher did. Her body stiffened, breath caught sharp in her chest. She backed away from the window, pressing herself against the inner wall like the logs might swallow her whole. Her fingers found the coat, the old one, the too big one, and clutched it like a shield. The rancher stepped outside, rifle in hand, not raised. He stared across the clearing, silent. The rider watched. Neither moved. Then, like smoke, the man on the ridge turned and disappeared behind the trees. When the rancher came back inside, his jaw was tight. He hung the rifle. She didn't ask who it was. He didn't ask why she'd turned pale. But that night he left the rifle loaded by the door. The curtain she'd fixed fluttered gently in the damp breeze. The air between them had changed again. Not with words, not with fear, but with the shape of something unspoken. Want, maybe, or need. Not the kind that burns hot, but the kind that sits in the bones and aches slow. They sat in the dim light of the lantern, the three of them, but each in their own separate silence. Her braid had grown long again. The rancher rubbed his calloused thumb along the edge of his tin cup like he was waiting for something to happen. But nothing did, because healing doesn't rush, and not all longing needs to be spoken. Watty rose before the sun, boots quiet on the dirt floor, his breath a faint cloud in the cold cabin air. He'd already packed, a small roll slung over one shoulder, bow and quiver resting easy on his back, no farewell speeches. No long goodbyes, still? She woke when he passed her cot, and stood without a word dot in his hand. He held a small carved object, smooth, dark wood shaped like a bird mid-flight. A comb, handmade, delicate despite its purpose. He pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers over it gently. "You will be seen again," he said. Then he was gone, footsteps fading into the wet hush of morning. She didn't cry until hours. Later, while washing potatoes at the basin, when the soft feathered tips of the comb caught her eye again, her tears fell without sound. She wiped them with her sleeve and kept slicing. She began to braid her hair differently after that, slower, with purpose. Like each twist of strand was a verse in a prayer she wasn't ready to speak aloud. She tied the end with a ribbon she found deep in the chest, faded blue. It stayed neat all day. The days grew longer. The mud thickened. The air smelled of sap and iron. She started cooking more, not out of hunger, but rhythm. Bacon in the pan, bread rising near the stove. She hemmed an old shirt she found folded and forgotten, patching it with a steadier hand than she remembered having. When it was done, she laid it beside the rancher's bedroll, said nothing. That evening he wore it without a word, but his hand lingered at the buttons. They sat together most nights now, not across the room but side by side, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel the other breathe. Once, he spoke of the wife he buried, a young woman with laughter in her voice and a weak heart that never stood a chance. Died in the cold same season he found her by the river. He said her name only once, Clara. The woman didn't answer, just sat still, her hands folded in her lap. Sometimes the silence spoke loud enough, the fire crackled low, would hissing as if it remembered the rain. Then came the night when it all changed. The air was still, too still. No crickets, no breeze. The river had quieted like it held its breath, and then the crack of a rifle shot, sharp and sudden, echoing from the hills. She jolted upright. The rancher was already moving, pulling his coat, his boots, his rifle. She froze near the hearth. Breath shallow, he glanced at her, not with fear, not with command, but with something quiet and firm. Then he did something he hadn't done before. He handed her the second rifle. She took it. Her hands did not shake. He looked her over once, eyes lingering not on her face, but on her stance, her grip. She wasn't a burden, not a guest, not a woman broken. She was part of the defense now. They moved together, boots silent on the porch, eyes scanning the tree line. Somewhere out there, past the dark pines and the swelling river, was a man she thought she'd escaped. The coat's true owner And he wasn't alone, but this time she wasn't alone either. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. The sky was iron gray when the men came. 3 riders, silent but certain, weaving through the pines with rifles slung low and eyes hungry for something they called justice. She knew the shape of the one in front before she saw his face, the tilt of the shoulders, the way he rode like the land owed him. Her heart did not race. Her breath did not quicken. She had been hunted by this man before. She would not be hunted again. The rancher stood beside her at the edge of the clearing, one hand on his rifle, the other bleeding from the graze of a warning shot they'd fired an hour before. He hadn't gone down. He hadn't run. She saw the moment recognition lit in the bounty man's eyes, the sneer, the disbelief. "You were supposed to die out here," he said. His voice was dry bone. "I sold you fair." She didn't answer, just lifted the rifle the rancher had handed her nights ago, the wood warm in her grip. Her finger curled slow, steady. One shot, clean. His horse reared. He fell sideways into the snow. He didn't die right away. He gasped, clawed at the white earth as if he could drag himself back to the deal he'd made, to the land he'd bought with her name. Blood soaked into the snow, staining it dark. She watched him try to speak. Something cruel, no doubt. Something final, but the words stuck. She did not go to him. She turned, walked back through the trees without looking over her shoulder. The other men didn't follow. It was 3 days later when they rode into town, the rancher stiff in the saddle, wound-dressed, coat heavy with dried blood. She rode behind him, bareheaded, braid neat, her too big coat gone. In its place, a shawl and a new calm, neither borrowed. They passed the general store, the blacksmith's, the little clapboard church with its crooked bell. People watched from porches, their murmurs hushed but sharp. She saw the way they looked at her, like a ghost, like a scandal, like a story no one had permission to tell. She met every stare. At the post, the rancher tipped his hat to an old man by the door and said, "Morning, miss." His voice was dry but gentle. She smiled, just faint. "Eliza," she said. It was the first time he'd heard it. They loaded supplies. Flour, coffee, lamp oil. She picked out a tin of peppermint and a new needle set. He bought a tin mug to replace the one that cracked when the stove fell during the fight. Then they rode home. The cabin came into view at dusk, the chimney smoking, the snow nearly all melted into thick earth. Chickens stirred near the coop. The door creaked when they opened it, familiar now, safe. She hung her shawl on the peg by the fire. Beside his coat, set the carved wooden comb on the windowsill, where morning light would find it, straightened the curtain she had mended once already. The fire popped, soft and steady. The rocking chair took up its old rhythm. He sat in it. She brewed coffee. They didn't speak much that night. They didn't need to. The scars were still there, his from the war and the wilderness, hers from rope, frost, betrayal. But scars didn't mean the wound was open. They were proof that it had healed. She hadn't been saved by him. She'd been given space, time, silence enough to hear. Her own voice again. Eliza. Outside, the wind whispered against the windows. Inside, the warmth lingered long after the fire had settled to coals. And when he looked across the room and met her gaze, she didn't look away.